Hello, and welcome to this course on educational research with a focus on advanced quantitative methods. So my name is Dr. Maliat, and I am excited to be exploring this idea of educational research with you. In this initial presentation, we're going to think about how a researcher's worldview and their understanding of knowledge is developed and how that matters for their own research projects. You might think, how does this relate to quantitative methods? Aren't we going to be talking about statistics in this course? So actually, something that is really important to keep in mind as you think about all types of research, both quantitative, qualitative, as well as mixed methods, is that you have to have a strong approach and design even before you start collecting and analyzing data. So that's why we're starting here in terms of thinking about how one approaches and designs educational research. Okay, so the purpose of this presentation, as well as all of the presentations in this course, is to complement and supplement your assigned readings for the module. So I'm not going to go through all of the concepts in the Creswell chapter or the Stage and Manning chapters, but I encourage you to come to our face-to-face meetings if you have any questions about any of those particular ideas. But I do want to explain what we mean and underscore what we mean by this idea of research. So it's a systematic process, essentially, or an established approach that we use to generate information or data and analyze that data or information with the goal of producing knowledge about the world around us. So the idea, right, is that we use data to better understand issues and also to make sense of the world and shape our beliefs rather than starting out with what we believe and then just trying to find data to confirm what we believe. So that's essentially a research approach. We start with a problem or an issue and we use a research approach to collect information to develop knowledge, right? And then research methods, more specifically, are the ways that we go about doing that. So as you have read in the Creswell chapter, as well as the other readings for this week, research methods, the main ones are quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods. And then within all of those traditions, there are particular, more specific methods, such as in quantitative research, right? Experimental methods, quasi-experimental methods, and descriptive methods are typically some of the most common quantitative research methods that are used in the social sciences. Something else I want you to think about is the importance of disciplinary perspectives in educational research. So education is by itself fundamentally an interdisciplinary field, right? So people study education from very, very diverse social science perspectives, which also influences the methodologies and the approaches they use. So the way a psychologist, for example, studies and thinks about issues in education might be quite different from a sociologist, an economist, or an anthropologist. The Ball and Forzani article that you're assigned to read this week offers a lot of really interesting questions to think about. And I'd love to have more conversations with you about this after you read about it and think about it. So they argue that education research, just because it happens in the context of a school or learning environment, it's not necessarily educational. And they argue that research becomes truly educational when it probes this idea of the instructional dynamic, right? The interaction of teachers, learners, and content that distinguishes educational research from more general social science research. So perhaps a sociologist who is studying something in a school, or an economist who's maybe studying financial issues in schooling, etc. So it's a provocative article, and it's an interesting debate. And I'd also encourage you to think about this article in the context of your topic. So higher education and technology, because I think it really provokes a lot of interesting thoughts about how your research could really be educational, right? So thinking about this instructional dynamic triangle between teacher, student, and content, what does that look like in online or digitally enhanced higher education settings? And what would research on digital learning platforms, how could that be really educational rather than just taking technological, economic, or sociological perspectives? And then also too, think about, for example, let's say you wanted to study an app or a new learning management system that's being introduced at Wallow University. What kinds of questions would help you to study that topic really from an educational standpoint rather than more generally social science? So this is, again, kind of a very philosophical charge, but it's really important, though, to think about how education research is situated as education as opposed to being, aligned with a single discipline or multidisciplinary perspectives. Okay, so you are studying for a PhD, which is a doctorate of philosophy, and perhaps you didn't realize, but this course on quantitative methods actually draws quite a bit from philosophy in terms of as we think about how we understand and experience reality as well as knowledge, that shapes actually our choice of research methods and approaches. So the Creswell reading does a nice job of discussing epistemology, but I also want to make you aware of the distinction between ontology and epistemology, because that also affects our orientation and our approaches that we choose in education research. So ontology basically is how we think reality exists, right? And so that's really philosophical. But what does that mean for education research? Essentially, quantitative researchers usually assume a realist or objectivist view, as opposed to qualitative researchers who think about reality as being socially constructive. And there can be reality is all just a basis of individual perceptions. But as quantitative researchers, we often take realist or objectivist views around ontology. And then thinking about epistemology, that's a little bit different because that's more about knowledge, right? And so as you know, research is about developing knowledge and collecting data. And so it matters in terms of how we think about what we know and our assumptions about knowledge and its sources, right? So how can we know reality and what counts as valid knowledge? Should we measure student learning using test scores, which is often what we do in quantitative research? Or is it better to learn or measure learning through student narratives if we believe that knowledge is socially constructed? So this is all, again, I know, very philosophical and complex, but it really matters for understanding quantitative research approaches versus qualitative and mixed methods. All right, so if you believe from an ontological standpoint that learning is measurable and it's a cognitive process, then you'll usually typically fall within more of a positivist or post-positivist epistemology. So I want to point out that more and more, and you'll read this in the Creswell book, education researchers and social scientists sort of are shying away from this idea of positivism because it's a little bit overly deterministic. So typically now quantitative researchers identify more in education, especially as post-positivists. So we acknowledge that there's complexities and dimensions of the world, the social world that we really can't completely reproduce or completely study in a vacuum, but that it's still possible to do research that is measurable and that allows us to generalize across people. And so that's where post-positivism comes in. So I'd encourage you, as a quantitative researcher, more and more, most of us identify as post-positivists. But then we get to critical and constructivist epistemologies, which also can be, especially critical theory, I want to point out, can be quantitative. But first of all, constructivist. This is usually, right, the idea that knowledge is socially constructed through human interactions and experiences. And there's not one, again, to the ontology piece, there's not one single objective reality, but we construct meaning based on our contexts. In education research, usually a constructivist researcher might explore how students make sense of a learning experience. And again, they often use qualitative methods like interviews or case studies, and their focus is really on understanding meaning, interpretation, and lived experience. So that's too how their research questions sort of align with those ideas. We'll get into that later in the course though. I just want to make sure you have sort of a high level understanding of the difference between postpositivism, constructivism, and then here critical theory, which Creswell calls transformative research approaches. Basically, the idea is that knowledge is shaped by hierarchies, power, and it's not neutral. It reflects and reinforces power structures in society. And so the idea from critical research is challenging those power structures. And I will demonstrate in future discussions, actually, critical theory can take a quantitative perspective or a qualitative perspective or a mixed methods perspective. So there's a whole, in higher education, a whole line of inquiry called critical quantitative research. The idea is that maybe too, like for you, you could look at how maybe digital tools reproduce educational equality, right? Or inequality, I guess. Digital tools reproduce the societal inequality and educational inequality in order to transform systems where people, for instance, many people in Ethiopia don't have access to digital learning and maybe AI and other types of digital and technology tools. And a critical theorist would study that explicitly to challenge that existing system, those existing structures. And so their research questions would be much more oriented towards, again, understanding not just how digital tools are being used in Ethiopia, but then also maybe challenging who has access to them and who does not have access to them. So this is an important sort of foundation to now as we go into thinking more at a micro level about how we're doing research. All right, so sometimes you can tell one's epistemology just from their research questions, sometimes not, but I'm a great example, and then we'll use your topic too for some examples. But I identify as a post-positivist. I also have used quantitative critical theory as another framing paradigm for some of my work. But mostly topic-wise, I study academic staff, workplace experiences, and careers in the United States, and now I've been doing a lot more work in Ethiopia. But you can tell just from my research question that I am pretty much a post-positivist. What predicts part-time faculty employment preference? So that is, if you see the verb predicts, that is a post-positivist or positivist question for the most part. So I am assuming here with this question that I can collect a lot of data from faculty, and I can use those data to predict what other people will want or prefer. So it's really kind of assuming there's one general reality around part-time faculty employment, and I'm going to try to better understand how we can predict their behaviors and what characteristics lead to their employment preference. And the same for these other two research questions. So that's a predictive one. This is a correlational one, right? How are perceptions of politics correlated with participation in governance? So again, this is a very post-positive question, as are, this one's a little bit less post-positivist. What are faculty attitudes towards college students with criminal records? I ended up using a pretty post-positivist methodology, but I could have used one that was actually more constructivist because this is a very flexible descriptive question. But more generally, right, these questions indicate the fact that, or the orientation of myself towards post-positivism. In contrast, so you, with your topical interest, digital technologies and education, you could certainly study a lot of questions that are from a post-positive perspective, right? So maybe how does online learning affect exam scores? So the idea, right, embedded in this question is that you're assuming you could collect data about a lot of students learning online, and you could see whether or not their online learning experiences affect or cause them to get certain scores on their exams. That's a pretty post-positivist sort of framing. But let's say you wanted to study digital technology from a more constructivist and perhaps qualitative perspective, right? Then you could ask a question, maybe, how do students experience and make sense of knowledge in technology-enhanced classrooms? That would be really difficult to study from a quantitative perspective, right? And so that's why usually post-positivists draw considerably from quantitative methods and answer or ask these types of questions, while constructivists often use qualitative methods to answer more sort of experiential and meaning-making type questions from a constructivist paradigm. Okay, in my next presentation, and actually in the rest of this course, we're going to get more into quantitative research. But I want to leave you with another more philosophical thought. And this came out in Ball and Forzani's article, which they argue that education research should be practical and concerned with improving practice. And that's not always the case, right? So my university, where I'm employed, I'm a professor at Arizona State University, and one of our university's design aspirations, or part of our mission, is for faculty as well as students to conduct use-inspired research, so practical research that can benefit society and our communities. And the same, I would say, is true of Wallowa University's new identity as a University of Applied Sciences in Ethiopia. So while we can think about being a University of Applied Sciences is about teaching students the skills they'll need to be productive and effective contributors to the workforce in their communities, I want you also to think about your PhD at Wallowa and your research as Wallowa fitting into this idea of a University of Applied Sciences, right? So should traditional research benefit you and not only you as an academic and a scholar, but also your communities and your country and the world around us? So thinking about research in more of an applied and less sort of abstract ivory tower standpoint, I would encourage you to do that. And that's something I also do in my work as a positivist, post-positivist scholar. I still want my work to matter and to be useful and to improve my community.